Wildlife Refuge before we dive into the Sandhill cranes. So it's located about 30 minutes northwest of the cities, or it's about a 2-hour drive from Duluth. It was established in 1965 for migratory birds such as the Sandhill crane. There's about 30,700 acres, or about 48 square miles, that are dedicated to conservation and habitat restoration. Some of the landscapes that we aim to conserve and restore are oak savanna and tall grass prairie, which are by far some of the most threatened landscapes in the Midwest. But besides conservation efforts, we also have education and recreational opportunities. So you can come here to snowshoe, hike, bird. We also have various events throughout the year. We're really known for our Sandhill crane viewing events that we have in the fall. We're also known for the migration of a lot of other birds in the spring and the fall, such as warblers, songbirds, and ducks. So we'd really love to see you come out here sometime, whether it's for one of our viewing events or to visit the refuge. But let's get into the cranes. So like the falls, they are prehistoric. A crane fossil that was thought to be 9 million years old was found in Nebraska and is structurally identical to the modern Sandhill crane. So it's thought to be maybe an ancestor of the modern Sandhill crane. And a little fun fact is that Sandhill cranes are named for the Sandhills region of Nebraska. And then there was also a fossil found 2.5 million years ago in Florida. It was found from 2.5 million years ago in Florida and was confirmed to be a Sandhill crane. And this makes them the oldest known bird species that's still surviving today. We also know that the greater and lesser subspecies of Sandhill cranes diverged about 2.3 to 1.2 million years ago. So Sandhill cranes are one of the 2 crane species that breed in North America, the other being the whooping crane. And the whooping crane is more rare and also the bigger of the 2. So the North American Sandhill cranes are the most abundant of the world's crane species, and they're divided into 3 non-migratory and 3 migratory subspecies. So the non-migratory subspecies are the Florida, the Cuban, and the Mississippi, and they all have relatively small populations that are in restricted ranges. So the Mississippi Sandhill cranes are considered critically endangered, and they have a population of a little over 100, and they can only be seen at the Mississippi Sandhill Crane National Wildlife Refuge. The Cuban population is also considered federally endangered, while the Florida population is listed as state threatened. As far as the migratory subspecies, we have the greater, the lesser, and the Canadian. And the Canadian is kind of controversial because there's evidence that shows it's a hybrid between the greater and the lesser subspecies. So there's a lot of researchers that are calling for the recognition of the subspecies to be abandoned and then reclassified as greater. In Minnesota specifically, we have the greater and lesser migratory subspecies. And the biggest difference between the 2, besides their breeding location, is just their size. So as you could probably guess from their name, the lesser is the smaller of the subspecies, while the greater is the larger. And then the Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge, we typically just see the greater subspecies here. So the migratory subspecies are then divided into 6 populations for management purposes. And this isn't dependent on the subspecies at all. It's just dependent on their geographical range, really. So we see 2 of these in Minnesota. And so the state of Minnesota contains the eastern boundary of the mid-continental population. So you can see that's the gray in the northwest area of Minnesota. And then we have the western boundary of the eastern population. And so that's the orange that you see in eastern Minnesota. And the eastern population contains almost exclusively greater sandhills and has about 90,000 cranes. And then the mid-continental population contains actually all of the migratory subspecies, but it's mostly lesser. And then it has about 600,000 cranes. And I'm sure many of you have at least seen those photos of the Sandhill cranes in the Platte River in Nebraska. So those cranes that migrate through that area are part of the mid-continental population. So since we mostly just see the greater Sandhill cranes on this side of the state, those are what we're going to be talking primarily about tonight. So the most striking feature of a Sandhill crane is that red patch on the top of their heads. And this is actually a patch of skin and not feathers. The adults also have a white cheek patch. They have a really long bill, and then they have mostly gray plumage. But you may have seen sandhill cranes with this rustier brown color more than that gray color. And that's because they like to cover themselves in this iron-rich mud that stains their feathers. And we think they do this as a camouflage tactic. So in this refuge area, the mud here is very rich, iron rich. So we always have seen sandhills that are this rust color. But in the spring, when they're molting new plumage, or maybe in areas where the dirt isn't as iron rich, they are still that pale gray color. As for those fluffy feathers that you see towards their back, they aren't actually a part of the tail. They are elongated wing feathers that are modified for display. And if you wanted to see their tail for some reason, you might be able to see it when they're flying. As for their eyes, they do have 3 eyelids. They have a top, a bottom, and then a third eyelid that's called the nictitating membrane. And this eyelid closes horizontally over the eye and helps keep it moist, and then also helps protect it from debris and dust, especially on their long migration journeys. So in this picture here, you can see that nictitating membrane, and it kind of just looks like a film over the eye. And a lot of animals have this too, like raptors, crocodiles, and maybe even your cat at home. So sandhills are pretty tall in stature, anywhere from 4.5 to 5 feet tall, with a 6 to 7 foot wingspan, or about the same as a bald eagle. And they can weigh anywhere between 6 to 12 pounds, with the males being slightly larger. But you can only really see this difference in mated pairs, so it's not really considered a good indicator of sex. And they can live in upwards of 20 years, with the oldest on record being 36 years old. And then depending on the speed and direction of wind, sandhills can fly on average about 25 to 35 miles per hour, but they've been clocked up to 50 miles per hour. So as a previous slide told you, these cranes are omnivorous, and actually all cranes are. So their diet will change throughout the year. In the fall, sandhills will readily eat cultivated foods such as corn, wheat, and sorghum. And they're doing this because they really want good energy for migration. So waste corn is particularly useful at this time of year to get nutrients for their long journey. And then in spring, they like high protein diets, also diets that have high calcium. And this is for their healthy eggs and chicks. And if you've ever seen a sandhill crane eat, they have this really slow strolling gait, and then they'll just pick up the food from the ground. So sandhills are pretty loud and they make tons of sounds. Actually, their vocalizations can be heard up to 2 miles away. So you might be wondering how. They have a very long trachea that coils, and their trachea also reverberates within their sternums. They also have an enlarged syrinx, which is the vocal cord for birds. And in a 4-foot tall bird, they have about 50 inches of windpipe. So as you can tell, they have evolved with an emphasis on vocalization in their anatomy. So there has to be some importance in their calls, but unfortunately, we don't really understand crane vocalizations, and there are a lot of them. So tonight, I'm only going to mention a few. And the first call that I'm going to mention is their flight call. And this happens more often in flight than when they're on the ground. And it's particularly common when groups take flight, and it's thought to perhaps aid in avoiding collision. So this is the flight call. All right, and then the next call that we have is the unison call. And this happens between pairs, with the male having a lower pitched 1-note call, and then the female has a 2-note call. And historically at the refuge, we used to use these calls to do breeding pair surveys, but we have ceased to do them since I think 2011. So this is a unison call. So you can really hear the tonal difference in that call. And then the last call that I have a sound bit for tonight is the purr. And this is a rather quiet, muffled click that's used when feeding. And it's also used during flight intention, for voicing flight intention. And so these aren't very easily heard, and it's thought to probably be quiet to help avoid detection by predators. So this is the purr. And I'll play that one more time for you. And then the last call that I'm going to talk about tonight is the guard call. And these are a very loud, resonant hooting sound and bugles that have a rattling or rolling quality, and it's given frequently in flight. So this is where sandhill cranes get their dinosaur-like call reputation from. So calls are used in courtship and mated pairs. So sandhill cranes are sexually mature at 2, but they can wait till as long as 7 to pair up. But at that point, then they'll mate for life. So when they're looking for their pair, they'll have these really elaborate courtship dances that usually involve wing flapping, bowing, and jumping. And they have 2 displays that are used to form mated pairs, while there's 3 other displays that only occur between mates, and they serve to maintain the pair bond. But dancing is not just used for courtship, it's also believed to be a part of motor development. So I have a video here taken by Christina Stahl, and you'll see that the dancing involves a lot of jumping and stomping and wing flapping. All right, so then once they find their mate, it's time for them to nest and breed. So as far as raising their young, the sandhill cranes share parental responsibility pretty well. They will work together to gather materials for the nest, but then the female will tend to arrange the materials. And they usually like to choose locations on small, isolated wetlands, and they'll prefer breeding habitats that contain open sedge meadows and wetlands and that are adjacent to short vegetation and uplands. So they can nest anywhere between 3 feet of standing water, and there are some that will nest on the dry ground. Their nests are typically built of the dominant vegetation of the area. So this will be like cattails or grasses, and sometimes they'll build it from the ground up. But if it is in a place like that has 3 feet of standing water, then they'll build a floating nest and then they'll anchor it to the standing plants around it. And then if they have water level changes and their nest somehow gets flooded, they will actually re-nest, and then the colts will just hatch a little bit later in the season. So once they finally have their nests all ready, they decide to lay their eggs, and they typically have clutch sizes of around 1 to 3 eggs. The eggs will be incubated for around 30 days, and then they'll have 1 to 2 chicks that will hatch, and typically they'll just have 1 colt that will survive to fledge. So sandhill cranes, they exhibit this very slow life history strategy, just like humans, where they live long, they defer breeding, they have low reproductive rates, and then they have high rates of survival into adulthood. So less than 20% of pairs successfully raise their young. And actually, sandhill cranes have the lowest recruitment rates of any North American game bird. And their success mostly just depends on how many seasons the pair has been together. So it's definitely a trial and error sort of thing for them. But if all things are successful, they'll have a chick. And during the first month, their chick will be this yellow, burnt orange plumage. At this time, the chicks sleep under their mother's wings. They basically just run around flapping their wings and eating food from their parents. And it's really important at this time for them to build up muscles in their legs and just learn how to use those really long legs. During their second month, the chicks will then become colts and their pre-flight training begins. So they'll be rust-colored or gray at this point, and they'll still not have that red crown that their parents have. During the third month, the colts will learn how to forage on their own, and during weeks 9 and 10, they begin to fledge. So their plumage within the first year will change from cinnamon brown to gray, and when the colts are about the same size as their parents, they look about the same, but the way that you can distinguish them is because they still don't have that red crown patch. And then so their call is kind of more of a peep than a rattle like their parents. But in the first few months of the crane's life, you can imagine that they're pretty susceptible to predation. So these predators that they have are coyotes, foxes, raccoons, ravens, owls, and also eagles. But once they are adults, they don't have nearly as many predators because they're so much bigger. So they'll typically stay with their parents for up to a year just for that safety aspect. They'll migrate with their parents and stay through winter until the following spring with them. So during their migration, as we talked about earlier, they do fly about 25 to 35 miles per hour, and they cover on average about 200 to 300 miles a day. But with favorable winds, they can travel up to 500 miles a day. During their migration, they like to fly at altitudes of about a mile high. So this map here just narrows down two of the migration pathways that we might experience in Minnesota. So we're talking about the mid-continental population, which you can see is the yellow and pink. And then we also have the eastern population, which is that orange and the green there. So the mid-continental population will migrate down to Texas, Mexico, and alternatively Louisiana. And they like to follow the Missouri River corridor. And then the east population will migrate down the coast of Florida, migrate down to the coast of Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. And they stay near sources of water such as the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes. We've seen recently that the eastern population doesn't fly as far south as they used to, because during milder winters, they only fly as far south as they need to. So they've been seen overwintering as far north as Kentucky. So I'm now going to pass this program over to Cynthia to talk about the Sandhills at Sherburne.
Thank you, Ranger Jade. So the second half of our talk, we're going to focus much more specifically on the sandhill cranes that we encounter at Sherburne in the fall, because that's when our refuge serves as a large staging area for the eastern population of greater sandhill cranes while they progress on their migration south toward Florida. It's important to note that while cranes do fly north again in the spring, they don't stage here in the spring. You may have noticed that eBird is already starting to record isolated crane sightings, though, in Minnesota. I find it interesting that at Platte River, spring sandhill gathering is huge. And you especially know that if you've watched their Department of Tourism TV commercial where the sandhill cranes are the star. But as far as their cranes in the fall, really not so much. For us, thousands of cranes congregate on our St. Francis Pool and other wetlands of the refuge from October through November. You might ask, what is it about this place that entices them to stop and spend time with us during their fall migration? The short answer is we really don't know, but we can take perhaps an educated guess. The majority of the eastern population cranes breed and nest around the Great Lakes, specifically Southern Ontario, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. As Ranger Jade mentioned earlier, I think we estimate that there are between 30 and 50 pairs of cranes that breed and nest at Sherburne each year. When these and the rest of the eastern population migrate, they move toward Florida. But you know, cranes are shorebirds, and they are a bit quirky, and they really don't like to fly over large bodies of water. So those birds that are coming from Canada tend to fly west to go around Lake Superior before they swing south. And that puts us directly in their migratory path. The smaller photo on this slide is an aerial shot of the St. Francis River Valley. That's at the heart of Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge. Historically, this particular river basin was one of our state's richest wildlife areas. Then In the late 1800s, Minnesota and other western frontier were opened by the Homestead Act, and settlers started to move into and across our state. To better support agriculture and increase usable agricultural acreage, they plowed the prairies and they drained the wetlands. Eventually, there was growing concern about conservation and for development and restoration of public lands. So we started to see things like the establishment of the first National Wildlife Refuge in 1904, establishment of the National Park Service in 1916, the passage of the Migratory Bird Act in 1918, which, by the way, included a specific prohibition against hunting sandhill cranes. By the 1940s, local conservationists and sportsmen became interested in restoring the St. Francis River Basin. It took a long time, but eventually it did lead to the establishment of our refuge in 1965. Prairie and wetlands restoration have continued to the present day. And to give you an example, when the refuge was established, it was about 34% wetlands, and now it's about 46%. The water in the refuge is very actively managed. And to the benefit of the birds that fly through, outside the borders of the refuge, we are surrounded on all sides by active agricultural fields, which, once they are harvested, become feeding grounds for the cranes. Next one. Next, we're going to take a humorous look at what might be called an overly simplified day in the life of an adult sandhill crane while they're staying with us at Sherburne. As birders, you guys know that observational success in the field is greatly enhanced when we understand the behavior. Where are they? When and what are they doing? So we'll start at dawn. Picture yourself standing in a pool of water, most likely at the St. Francis Pool. It's safe here in the refuge. You've been here all night, asleep. You hear your family and your neighbors begin to vocalize as they too greet the day. Stretch your wings, move your legs a bit, not too much. The sound around you gets louder and louder as more and even more cranes awaken. But at dawn, no bird is in too big of a hurry to be too active yet. Okay. Morning. Finally, like a pebble cast into a pool of cool, clear water that sends out gentle, rippling waves, a bird takes flight, and it's joined by its mate or its family group. Slowly, a few more, and then a few more go up into the air. They make their way out of the refuge singly, in pairs, and in small groups. North, south, east, west. You know, there are agricultural fields all around us, and it's time for breakfast. In this photo, you can see one of the characteristics of the sandhill cranes. Unlike other birds, when they fly, they tend to hold their heads and their feet straight out. Okay, daytime. As Ranger Jade mentioned, during egg laying and nesting season, the crane diet contains foods high in calcium and protein. But migration is a marathon, and carb loading is more in line with what is needed. So the sandhills spend their daylight hours hanging out in the harvested agricultural fields outside of the refuge, eating. Corn seems to be especially favored. Dusk. It's time to head back to the safety of the refuge to get settled in for the night. And you'll notice that these cranes look like they're preparing to land. Unlike the ones we saw earlier where head and feet were extended in flight, In these, landing gear is extended. Evening. Here we are, back in our shallow pool with all our family and friends, where we will roost and be safe through the night. A short while ago, I alluded to the effects that homesteading and agriculture have had on the lands. Accompanying the dramatic loss of wildlife habitat is the species that rely on it. Unregulated hunting leads to further diminishment of species. So by the late 1800s, the eastern population of greater Sandhill cranes was nearly extirpated from its historical breeding range. It takes a long time for a dramatically disturbed ecosystem to recover, if that's possible at all. We estimate, as we've mentioned, that we typically see 40 to 50 breeding pairs on the refuge each year. In addition, to monitor sandhill populations that stage and pass through our refuge, we conduct an annual fall sandhill crane count. Single day peak counts are reflected on this table from 1992 through last year. And as you can see, while there were fewer than 100 cranes that staged at Sherburne in 1992, those numbers have been slowly and steadily increasing. Since all of you are birders, and I bet you that most of you have participated in bird counts, we thought you might be interested in how we perform our fall crane counts at Sherburne. It's pretty low tech. We count once a week on Wednesday, beginning in October and continuing into November, when the surfaces of the pools tend to ice up overnight. On this graphic, all of the potential sites where counters might be situated are marked. However, the number of sites which are actually used will vary from year to year, dependent on availability of staff and volunteers in that given year. Last year, our counters were very severely limited due to COVID restrictions. The turquoise dots on the northern edge of the boundary represent stations that were used last year. And there's also one on the west side. The yellow ones are other potential sites. Early in the morning, the counters are stationed at their spots all around the outside edges of the refuge. They have paper, pencil, and a clipboard in hand, and they watch the sky overhead and count groups of cranes as they leave for the day, headed out to the surrounding fields for food. Since most of the cranes go north and west, we always have increased numbers of counters in those directions. We know the cranes are continuing on in their migration, moving on to warmer location when the weekly counts begin to drop off. And that usually does coincide exactly with when the pools begin to ice over. If you haven't been there already, we would certainly invite and encourage you to visit Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge in the fall so that you might experience this wondrous phenomena for yourself. We provide resources and a variety of viewing options. We have designated parking areas that you can watch them fly over, such as the star that you see kind of in the 12 o'clock position in this circled map. You can sit there and park in that parking lot in the comfort of your warm car, watch them fly out of the refuge at dawn, back in at dusk. And from that particular location, you can also see the northern part of the St. Francis Pool. that area around the St. Francis Pool is a restricted area that we keep closed to the public for the privacy and benefit of the sandhill cranes that sleep overnight in that area. We also have fairly up-to-date maps of local fields just outside of the refuge where cranes have been seen congregating and feeding during the day. And for the very adventurous, we have some off the beaten path instructions for closer viewing, so that at dawn and dusk, it's actually possible to get to the southern edge of that St. Francis Pool by either hiking or biking. And the photo that's on the wall behind me is one that I took when I hiked in myself last year during the peak of the staging. Lastly, we do offer crane tours, pre-dawn educational programs led by refuge staff, where you're able to get even closer and enter the restricted area. But I've got to warn you that those are wildly popular, as you might imagine, and they tend to fill up very rapidly. So if you would like to attend one of those, you should very closely watch the websites, either the Sherburne website or the Friends of Sherburne websites. And as soon as they become available, they post in those locations. We're planning to post the Sherburne website web address in the comments section, but you can also just Google it and find it pretty quickly. Lastly, before we go to our question and answer time, Ranger Jade and I would like to close with a short video that was taken by one of our friends, volunteer photographers, Bruce Ellingson.
All right, so now we are all ready for questions if you have any.
I have one. Are they noisy at night too, in the fall? All night long?
You know, that's actually a good question, because the wildlife refuge is only open from a half hour before sunrise and closes at a half hour after sunrise. I haven't been on the property during the middle of the night to know how noisy they are.
Yeah. Well, I went to Nebraska in the spring and I don't know that any of them slept all night long. We sure
Oh,
heard them.
wow.
So prior to Euro-Americans coming here and farming everything, what were the sandhill cranes primarily eating in the fall migration? Since their major diet is corn and sorghum and wheat.
Wheat.
Yeah, what would they be eating? Well, those three weren't here pre-Euro, Euro-American.
That's a really good question.
Didn't they eat oak seeds from trees, especially from oak and things of that?
I have no idea. That's why I was curious. Yeah, no clue.
Yeah, that could be very possible. I don't have a set answer for you. I do only know that it's an adaptive trait that they started to eat from human fields, cultivated fields.
And I do know that there's a lot of wild rice in the pools of the refuge, but I'm not sure if they eat any of that.
And are they omnivorous? Do they also eat things like minnows and frogs and things?
They are omnivorous.
Yep, they are. But they typically only eat that stuff in the spring. They only eat the like small fish and insects in the spring.
So have you ever seen anything on how these migrations compare to the ones, say, like at the Bosque del Apache and those western migrations, when they have those massive amount of birds hanging out there in the fall as well?
Yeah, so you might be talking about the Nebraska ones. Those
No,
are the ones I guess I'm more familiar with.
yeah, that's it. These are even like farther west. They'd be the western ones, like
Okay.
in New Mexico and that part.
Yeah, for our migration, the peaks again are only around like 13,000 to 15,000 a day, which is still a lot compared to what it
Yeah.
used to be. But it's nothing like the Western populations where they have hundreds of thousands in their populations.
Only 13,000 is not a bad day, really.
It's a
Yeah,
great-
I mean,
It's gotta make
regardless,
us smile.
it's still awesome.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah,
great day.
for sure.
Have any of you been out there in the fall to Sherburne to see the migration?
I have not, but we've been chatting on the side, me and another board member, and we're planning a trip already.
It is awe-inspiring. I just can't say enough about it, and especially those crane tours that are led by our rangers, where you get to go into the restricted area. So when I went on one, we actually went in the pre-dawn, so it was still semi-dark and really hard to see. And we were standing at the southern edge of this St. Francis pool. No, we were on the north side because we came in on the restricted area. And it was still dark, but we could hear them. They were really, really, really noisy. And as it gets lighter and lighter, I'm thinking that I'm seeing just only reeds everywhere. And gradually, as it lightens, I'm realizing that those are not reeds and rushes that I'm seeing. Those are cranes. In the beginning, they're just still. And then they start to move a little bit. And then they start to fill the sky up. It's just an incredible experience. So do it if you can.
What weeks in September and October are good weeks to come to see them?
Well, the peak, they're going to peak just before the pools freeze. So they start gathering and slowly build up. Earlier in that season, even when you drive around our wildlife drive, you'll be able to see them in some of the fields. But to actually see them collecting in the pools, that would be the very end of October and the beginning of November. This picture behind me, I took last year on November 6th.
So then do you get bunches of snow geese intermixing with them at the same time?
You know, I don't remember seeing snow geese.
Okay.
So I've been down to Crex Meadows near Grantsburg, Wisconsin,
Mhm.
and seen the very similar program in the late October. So it's a lot closer for us here in Duluth to go down to Crex Meadows.
Aha, okay.
It was wonderful. Greg, it was a highlight to go in
Yeah.
October at 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
We got to do that next fall.
Yes, we should do that together.
Take Jeff with us too.
Okay.
if you buy supper, that's fine.
Always working an angle.
Always working an angle. This isn't so much a question, but I guess it could turn into one. But when I lived in southern Wisconsin, I wasn't very far from Horicon Marsh, where there are some whooping cranes as well. And one time I remember a whooping crane and a sandhill crane had paired up.
Oh, my.
Yeah, and they produced a colt.
They
and
did.
But once that colt reached a certain age, the DNR came and collected it. I imagine it's probably because, it's a threat to, some repopulation efforts for the whooping crane to have a hybrid. But whether the colt was eliminated or, taken to a facility, the Crane Foundation or something like that, we don't know. But it caused quite an outrage because people thought it was kind of unnatural to take this colt away from its parents and all that kind of stuff. But I imagine conservation was in the background. I don't know if you've heard anything about, how hybridization might affect these kinds of things. But
No, I think at the refuge, we've only actually seen one whooping crane in the recent years. So we haven't had any of the hybridization parts here. I do know between the other subspecies, there's very little crossbreeding there, but I don't think that they don't have as much of a problem with it as it sounds like they did with the whooping crane and the sandhill there.
Well, because subspecies are the same species. They're
Yeah,
all Antigone canadensis, whereas a whooping crane is grus something. I don't know what the species. And interestingly, you probably know, sandhill cranes used to be included in the grus genus. I think it was in 2010 when they started to do genomics that they realized it was a different species and moved it so that it was Antigone canadensis instead of grus canadensis. Sorry, nerdy stuff. So I'm actually a little surprised that they could make a colt.
any other questions for our guests?
Just want to say this has been a very good, fascinating presentation. And we surely commend you for your work there in not only compiling this and presenting it, but also for your advocacy for the Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge. Thank you for your work there.
thank you.
Thank you.
Indeed. And thank you for being with us this night. And yeah, if anybody thinks of a question, we can always send that on to them and hear a response back as well. I think it would be a lot of fun, like everybody's been talking about, to get down to either Sherburne or Crux Meadows in the fall and see the sandhill cranes staging as they begin their fall migration. So
The only question I've got for those of us who live far away and would have to come down probably on 169, what's the good access road to get off to go to where we might see them well?
Do you have the answer, Cynthia?
So I am extraordinarily directionally challenged. I know how I get in there without getting lost, and I can walk around in the woods without getting lost, but to give somebody directions on how to drive on the freeway, I apologize.
So where can we meet you to follow your car in there? Okay? Can we buy you coffee in Zimmerman
Coffee is always welcome. No, to get into Sherburne, if you know where Zimmerman is when you're coming down 169, So we're just north of Zimmerman on 169. You take County Road 9, that exit, and then you take a left, which is going west. And it's about 5 miles in from that on County Road 9 until you get to the headquarters area and our Oak Savannah Learning Center. And the other parts that we're talking about with those pools, if you keep going west on 9, eventually you'll hit County Road 5. You take a north to get up to this pool, for example.
We'll Google it and follow our nose.
We've got great maps and resources available at the refuge, and a lot of volunteers that are hanging around to act as guides and to answer questions as you're driving around. We can tell you which fields they've mostly been seen in during the daytime.
Very good. Thanks again. Before everybody heads off into their evenings, I wanted to also announce that next month we'll have our very own Clinton Dexter Nienhaus with us to talk about the American kestrel monitoring that goes on at the Saxon Bog. So